there's this argument that among the many forces that Columbus unleashes on the New World and the Old World, that one of the most powerful of these forces is capitalism. The argument goes something like this, that the colonization of the New World basically creates this marketplace for goods because you have a bunch of goods on one side of the Atlantic that are exclusive to that side. There's a demand for those goods as they get transported to Europe, and eventually vice versa. And so this stimulation of markets eventually creates capitalism. Karl Marx essentially makes this argument in Das Kapital. He writes, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, and other events signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. Now, before your parents fire off an angry email accusing me of trying to convert you all to become communists, by the way, I'm not. Trying to convert you into monarchists, but communism, nah. Any hoodles, I disagree with Marx's argument. And I'm going to tell you why. Because capitalism is defined as an economic system where production of goods, services, etc., are privately owned. What Marx himself uses definitionally is an economic system where the means of production, the stuff that produces wealth, in other words, is held by private hands as opposed to held by the state. So what we see in the colonization of the New World is not capitalism by that definition. That doesn't mean, however, that it's not important. You do see some revolutionary changes. It's just not capitalism. The question is, what isn't done? And that's what we're going to be spending the next little bit talking about. So before we talk about new markets and all the changes brought about by the Columbian Exchange, we have to talk about the Columbian Exchange itself a little bit more. Because it's not just coloring in lines on a map. It actually is this unprecedented event, at least in human history, where two halves of the world suddenly come together. And we're not just talking about two branches of humanity coming together, because on those human ships you have non-human things, such as animals that were exclusive to either the Western Hemisphere or to like Europe or the old world, shall we say. And you also have crops that are similarly exclusive to either one hemisphere or the other. I'm sure that a lot of you have seen these kinds of things before. And by the way, I am probably not going to test you on whether or not a potato is a new or an old world crop. But just so you know, if you're looking at food and plants, like potatoes, tomatoes are exclusive to the New World. I mean, think about that. So imagine Italian cuisine before the tomato. Imagine food before, like, chocolate, because the cocoa bean, I mean, that is exclusively a New World crop. Similarly, you have the transplantment of New World crops to the Old World. So, for example, sugarcane and rice. It turns out that the tropical areas of the West Indies, the Caribbean, in other words, become ideal for growing things like sugarcane. So you have this exchange of different crops, you have this exchange of different animals. Europe gets the turkey. And more importantly, they get the llama, the alpaca, and the guinea pig? Really? On the flip side, the New World gets the horse, the goat, the pig, the sheep, cattle, chicken, and camel. Just in case you're not literate and can't read that yourself. Now, it's in diseases, however, that there's a huge disparity between the New and Old World. So, on the one hand, the New World gives the Europeans diseases like syphilis and hepatitis. The Old World brings diseases like bubonic plague, chickenpox, cholera, flu, leprosy, malaria, measles, smallpox, typhoid, and yellow fever. Ultimately, this might be the single most important thing about the Columbian Exchange. Disease causes, particularly smallpox, roughly 80% of the Native American population to die. That's one thing to kind of remember about European conquistadors. They kill a lot of people, but the technology at the time didn't allow them to single-handedly reduce the Native American population. No, most of this comes from things like smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, flu, all of these diseases that Native Americans have no historical immunity against. So 80% of the population dies from disease. Within a century after the Columbian Exchange, 90% of the population that had existed before the Columbian Exchange is lost. So you have this huge population gap, and Europeans kind of fill that gap by bringing in other Europeans and eventually black slaves. We'll talk a lot more about that later. So the dominant economic theory and economic system during this time period was this thing called either mercantilism, or I've also heard it pronounced mercantilism, tomato, tomato. But basically, the idea of mercantilism, that's the pronunciation I'm most comfortable with, is the idea that the prosperity of a nation, the wealth of a nation, is dependent on how much money or capital it has. Now, a note on what money or capital is, because, the form that money takes over history has changed. We talked about flying money that the Chinese developed, which is basically a system of paper money. In this sense, the idea is that what is real money is money that is either gold or silver or based in gold and silver. And that in order to maximize the amount of gold and silver that you have, a government should try to export more goods than import, because the idea is that if you export more goods, people are going to pay you for that in gold and silver, whereas if you're importing fewer goods, you're going to lose less of your supply of gold and silver. So if you get a favorable balance of trade, if you're exporting more than you're importing, the idea is that this is going to increase your overall amount of wealth. Now, think about that, because that's the view that wealth is entirely based on gold or silver. So if, the idea is that I could own a lot of land, I could own a lot of personal property, but that doesn't really make it wealth because I'm still cash poor, right? I could be incredibly wealthy based on other definitions of wealth, but still poor because I don't have money that's based in gold or silver. So, in other words, it's not just the theory that you're rich if you have money. I mean, okay, that's pretty obvious. But the idea of mercantilism or mercantilism is the idea that money should be defined very, very narrowly. So the idea is that you're going to utilize colonies basically to strip mine and take everything of value, bring them back to the mother country, manufacture those raw materials into some form of good, and you can sell those goods to other countries, other places, including your own colonies. So, if it feels like this is kind of a vampiric relationship, then you're not wrong. Basically, the mother country is mooching off of the kids, the colonies, uh, which is, yeah, kind of perverse. So, key tenet one. The prosperity of a nation is dependent upon how much gold and silver it has. So the idea is that the New World is literally going to be used to mine things like gold and silver. You ship them to the mother country, and then you hold this stuff in your treasury. And in fact, the amount of gold and silver and valuables exported to the New World, the Old World, becomes such an event that basically every year the Spanish would send treasure ships starting from the Manila in the Philippines. They would set sail, land in Mexico. They would then move the goods overland, ship those goods from Veracruz, and ship them all the way, I think, to Vigo, Spain, or maybe Cordoba. But by the way, this also gave rise to the era of piracy. But the idea is that you ship all of this gold and silver back to the Old World. So key tenet number 2, government should export more than import. So this also requires some degree of economic self-sufficiency on the part of your home country. And typically, it means that governments are going to encourage basically specialization in certain goods. We'll talk about that when we sort of review David Ricardo a little bit later. Finally, you utilize the colonies to make these raw materials. Where that could be like clothing, or sorry, that could be things like crops, fur, wood, gold, silver, whatever. And then you manufacture those goods into clothing or furniture or alcohol, art, jewelry, whatever. But then you sell those things back to the colonies. And because you control the manufacturing process, and because most people who know how to manufacture things like jewelry or clothing or whatever, because they have a decent livelihood and they don't want to risk that livelihood by moving to the New World, it means that for these things to get made, they have to go to the Old World. And it means that the Old World can make a killing when they re-export this stuff back to the colonies. And again, it is a very parasitic and one-way relationship. Hi, down here again. So, modern-day economists would say that wealth isn't based on how much precious, shiny metal you have. I guess you can call that the Scrooge McDuck school of economic thought. Instead, it's based more on what people do. So when you have things like gross domestic product, or GDP, which is how we generally measure the amount of wealth generated by a country or society in a given calendar year, that tends to take into account the total value of all goods and services produced by that society. But in the 18th century, so well, actually from the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, you're looking at whether or not you have a society that has a favorable balance of trade and whether or not you control the total amount of precious shiny. So here's the problem. This is not capitalism, because capitalism requires the private ownership and control of goods and services. In this case, it's not the private sector, it's not businesses that are focused on gold and silver, it's the state. So it's going to take capitalism more than a hot minute to actually be born, and we'll cover that a good deal later.